I've already mentioned the first point that he spent time with others before he finally settled with Imam Abu Hanifa, may Allah be pleased with him. But in the Kufan circles, if you like, he had many teachers. I've mentioned them here, but the one that we've just mentioned is Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman bin Abi Layla, who, of course, Imam Abu Hanifa studied with. This particular person is important because, as you can see in this slide, it was through Ibn Abi Layla that we find that we can trace his isnad back to the companion Ibn Mas'ud. So through Sha'bi, you can get to Ibn Mas'ud, but also through Ibn Abi Layla, you have Al-Hakam bin Utayba, Ibrahim al-Nakhai, who inshallah we will talk about at some point in the future. And then we return to Ibn Mas'ud, and of course to the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And he also benefited from ulama in Basra. So these are some names that he benefited from and studied with. But the influence is overwhelmingly in Iraq. So Kufa and Basra were two places. But of course, it's not exclusive, like I mentioned before. He also studied with scholars that would have their lineage back to Madinatul Munawwara, the sacred city. And you have Malik ibn Anas ibn Ishaq, all stellar names. Hisham ibn Urwa, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, amongst others as well. And so I just wanted to mention that about Imam Abu Yusuf. Now, something that's interesting, and I think this is an influence of him spending time with hadith scholars, as we will see, is that Imam Abu Yusuf combined deep understanding of the religion, of the Sharia, but he was also given to understanding in hadith. He focused a lot on textual evidence as well. So not only was he just doing fiqh, he was combining fiqh with hadith, textual evidence. That's what I mean by that. And this was something very, very important. And of course, he was also a qadi, which we will see, insha'Allah ta'ala, when it comes to Imam Abu Yusuf. So you find here in some of these anecdotes that's mentioned about him, ما رأيت في أصحاب الرأي أثبت في الحديث ولا أحفظ ولا أصح رواية من أبي يوسف. They mentioned that no, from the people of Ashab al-Rai, this was what they would call them in those days, from Imam Abu Hanifa's circle, someone who's more firm in hadith, no one more who memorized more, no one who's more correct in mentioning narrations than Imam Abu Yusuf. So Imam Abu Yusuf really brought hadith into the Hanafi madhab. It was used, but Imam Abu Yusuf emphasized this idea that one should cite their sources, one should mention who they are taking knowledge from. So I just wanted to mention that about him. Other places you see here, he was munsifan fil hadith. He was very known to be very just and fair when it came to applying hadith. And he was Yahya ibn Ma'in. What did he say? كان Abu Yusuf يحب أصحاب الحديث ويميل إليهم. That he loved the people of hadith and he would incline towards them. So this idea that Hanafi madhab is not based on hadith or doesn't have hadith, it's based exclusively on right, it's complete nonsense, and it doesn't stand to any form of real scholarship. If you really dig deep, you'll find that this was happening early on in the circle of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. And then you can find an exhaustive praise, recognition of Imam Abu Yusuf. I've just picked one or two. There's many that you can pick. So for example, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, I would call him Suduq, but he would also say munsifan fil hadith. He was seen, perceived to be fair when it came to hadith. Yahya ibn Ma'in, we talked about him already, that he inclined towards, Imam Abu Yusuf inclined towards the scholars of hadith a lot, and he would write from them, and he would spend his time with them as well. So you'll find many ulama praising Imam Nasa'i, calls him thiqa, reliable himself, and many other. Imam Ibn Hibban, for example, says kana shaykhan mutqinan. He was known to be very well versed, knowledgeable in the science of hadith. So you're seeing, I guess the point here is you're seeing hadith scholars early on praising Imam Abu Yusuf for his knowledge in hadith, right? And you can bring out many actual points on this when it comes to Imam Abu Yusuf. Okay, so I just wanted to mention this to you. Okay, let's move on to his role as a judge, because he was called Qadi, Imam Abu Yusuf, the judge, Imam Abu Yusuf. And this is an interesting mixture, an intersection coming together of scholarship and politics. Unfortunately, today we see and and we see all of this separately. We see ulama kind of aloof from engaging in politics. But if you read most of Islamic history, most biographies, many ulama, they spoke to rulers, they engaged with rulers, they gave them nasiha, they advised them, they corrected them, they reminded them of their duty as being the caliph or the imam of the ummah. So the ulama were the ones who made sure that the sharia was being applied. They would make sure the rulers were aware of their duty to apply and to make sure that they were doing justice. If they felt that rulers were too far, to becoming too extreme, they would take them to account. So Imam Abu Yusuf was involved in politics, and he played a really important role, actually. He was the architect in many ways of intertwining politics with scholarship. And so Imam Abu Yusuf, he served as a judge under at least three Abbasid caliphs, Al-Mahdi, Al-Hadi, and Imam Haroon, Khalifa Haroon al-Rashid. And he became the first chief judge in that period in Islamic history under Haroon Rashid. And you have to understand for a moment here what this means and what shifts were taking place. Until this time, we did have qadis, we did have judges, but they weren't part of the central government, if you like. It wasn't centralized. Under Harun al-Rashid, things were becoming more centralized because the Islamic Empire was growing. We need to have governance, and things needed to be structured properly. So that's what's happening under the rule of Harun al-Rashid, and Imam Abu Yusuf appears at that moment as an important person who bridges that gap as well. And so he kind of becomes what some people would say the proto-Qazi, right? Because the Qazi until then didn't really have a religious judicial post. They were just dealing with things locally. And the judge was also sometimes an administrator. So he would, for example, Muslims had garrison towns. Garrison towns are towns where you have military and they are strategically important. And so he would work, for example, with the commander or the emir of these garrison towns where the military is based. And he would advise them and give them nasiha and how to organize things and so forth and so on. So they were really working at a local level. And in many cases, they were dealing with local issues, things to do with conflicts between tribes, and they were more like a hakim. There were people who were just organizing things between people, and they were usually advising on things to do with inheritance or things to do with crime. So they didn't really have, you didn't have a judge as we popularly conceive of it today. But this began to change under the growth of the Islamic Empire. As the empire grew, we needed to centralize things. And so this is what happened. So we had specialization and we had centralization. And so two things really happened here. Things were becoming much more complex. Muslims were taking over more land. They were coming into contact with all sorts of people, all sorts of ideas. And so we needed a structure. And it wasn't just now whether Qazi was needed to solve things to do with inheritance or disputes between people, but we also needed what was called religious magistrates, and we needed people to manage things at a higher level, at an international level or national level, if you like, today. And so the Qazi's role here becomes much more centralized, and we find that they are now being appointed to work quite close to government because leaders need people to advise them in how to manage their affairs. So you find this under the Umayyad Marwanid Caliphate, and you also find this under the Abbasid Caliphate as well. So I just wanted to mention this to you because this contextualizes that Imam Abu Yusuf was living in a world that was rapidly shifting, and he responded to the needs of the time. So the ulama have to be quite flexible. They have to be open-minded. They have to be, of course, well-versed in the Sharia. They have to be brave, and they have to be ready to support the cause of the religion, whatever is needed at that moment in time. Now, we'll come back to this later on, but I just want to do it now, just in case we don't have time at the end, which is to focus on his scholarship. So the sort of books that he produced. So you can imagine he's an incredibly busy man. I mean, to work for a government at a high level would mean that he's an incredibly busy person. Nonetheless, Imam Abu Yusuf produced some very, very important works, which give us a window into how the Muslim world was at that early formative period. And there are a number of books, Kitab al-Asar, اختلاف ابن أبي ليلى وأبي حنيفة, والرد على سير الأوزاعي, Kitab al-Kharraj, which is a very, very important book. And so there are many books that were produced and written by Imam Abu Yusuf. One of them here is Kitab al-Asar. And this is an important book that one should read. The second one is, and these books are all available, اختلاف Abi Hanifata wa Ibn Abi Layla. So these are his two teachers. And this is a wonderful book to read with a teacher if you get a chance. It's reproduced actually if you look at Imam Shafi'i's book called and he comments about it. And it's also, part of it is also produced in the Kitab al-Asl, which is now available. You can buy it. You can buy that book. And this book is important, the second one here, the Ikhtilaf book, because it's one of the early books that you'll find of Islamic law. So Imam Abu Yusuf is a pioneer. He's a real pioneer, not just in terms of the Hanafi madhab, but just as a person who really thinks about Islamic law. The book itself, just for your information, it has 263 cases of law, and it's divided into 35 chapters. And the basic approach, if you were to look into the book, is that Imam Abu Yusuf gives opinion of his two teachers, as you can tell by the title, Abu Hanifa and Abu Layla, and then he gives his own opinion. So he had the confidence, and this was something that was nurtured, of course, by Imam Abu Hanifa and his teachers, which is that you train students really well, and you give them the confidence to do their own research, and they can have their own views, which might differ from the view of their teachers. Might seem strange to us today because we have a strong emphasis on deference to our teachers, and that should be there. We should have adab for our teachers, of course. No one is discounting that, but a good teacher wants his students to do really well, and he wants them to do their own research, and he wants them to come to their own conclusions as part of their own development. Sometimes that's missing. People just rehash what's been said before without thinking about, well, how can I improve? How can I build? How can I add? How can I supplement what has come before me? And so Imam Abu Yusuf himself would say, وَبِهِ نَأْخُذْ, and he would provide his own views on many things as well. And you'll find in there that he often evidence is given on what's come before. So precedent, which we'll talk about in this lecture, what's come before, what have people said before. Sometimes they will engage in a form of legal reasoning, and sometimes you'll see that both methods are adopted. This pink book here, that's how it's printed. That's the Ar-Radd ala Sir al-Awza'i. It's produced again in Al-Um by some comments by Imam Shafi. Just in the interest of time, we're just going to move on. So Kitab al-Kharraj is an important book. This is available too. This gives you some real insight in statecraft, how to organize a government and to make sure it functions the way it ought to function. The death date for the great Imam Abu Yusuf the earliest sources indicate that he passed away in 182 Hijri of the common, that's 798 of the common era. That's when he passed away. That's what details we have about Imam Abu Yusuf when he passed away. May Allah bless him and preserve his legacy for all of us to benefit from. So that's just a quick overview of Imam Abu Yusuf. And now I want to just indulge in a little bit more with you, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. I don't suggest we stop for a break. I think we should continue because we have Salah Maghrib. So I do need to leave. So we will just continue and then stop just before Maghrib. Now, many of you will be familiar with the method or the approach of the Hanafi Mazhab. Some of you may not know. And I remember, as a personal anecdote, many moons ago when I was first studying, I remember going for Hajj. And I was just a student then. I still am a student, of course, but my level of learning was very low, shallow then. And I remember when we were going for Hajj, certain people in our group and people when we got to Mecca and Medina were throwing these accusations around the Hanafi Mazhab is not based on Hadith, and it's all based on people just making things up and reasoning and nothing to do with Hadith. And of course, that can be quite overwhelming when you're quite young. But over time, you realize that that's utter nonsense and that's a lie and a fabrication against Imam Abu Hanifa and his school. And to be honest, most people, because of the simplistic nature of the way these things are presented to them, they can't see that history is quite complex. And I'm hoping that over this lesson and the few lessons you've had with me and your other teachers, you can see that's actually quite complex, yet beautiful to understand. So for Hanafis, and you can read this in the books of the fiqh, the Quran is the primary source of law. If you think about, if you want to make an argument or you want to take a position, of course you would try to root it in the Quran, because the Quran is mass transmitted, it's mutawatir, and there's no doubt about the content of the Quran. So as a legal principle, you would want to root your arguments in the Quran, the literal kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when you read the Quran or you recite the Quran, it becomes very clear that when it comes to legal content, it's very minimalist. There's not much legal content in the Quran when you approach it as a lawyer or a scholar of fiqh. What the Quran actually does is that beyond that, it establishes general principles that you can derive from the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, don't go near fornication. So there's this idea that if you abstract, that don't allow yourself to go near immorality. Close that door off, shut that door off, because it can lead to consequences, evil consequences. So you don't wait for a crime to happen, but you prevent or you put procedures in place, or you think about ways that you don't even need to go to an immorality. So that you get these principles in the Quran as opposed to detailed rules. And this is what happens when you reflect deeply upon the divine revelation. And so what happens is, based on this understanding that there's minimalist legal prescription in the Quran, but we can gain insights from just thinking about what Allah is saying in the Quran, we can then develop a theory, a legal theory. And so that allows us to expand the number of rules that we can derive from the Quran. And so when you read the books of Imam Abu Yusuf, which we won't have time to do today, you can see that he's rooting a lot of his insights in the Quran as a source of law. And this is something that the Hanafi ulama later on do. So if you're well trained, you'll see that when they argue, they're using ideas and theories, usul, that's taken from the Quran. They may not mention it explicitly because you're supposed to know it as a scholar. The whole point of you becoming a scholar is that we don't need to tell you the basics. You should be at an advanced level where you can read between the lines what's being said. So you find this. So when you read Imam Abu Yusuf's theory, you'll find this is the case. And the Quran becomes very, very important in the Hanafi madhab as a source of law or a source of inspiration for guiding principles. And it's also becoming an important point for analogy. So you look at the Quran and you think, okay, what situations can I apply this to? Or if I find myself in a situation that's new, that's not mentioned in the Sunnah, that's not mentioned in the Quran, can I use verses from the Quran? Can I use them to use the art of analogy, qiyas, to kind of help me in this situation? And of course, any hadith that goes against the Quran, that immediately becomes problematic, because the hadith would never go against the Quran. The hadith would never run up against the Quran. So if you understood or you saw hadith in that way, then they would have methods, interpretive methods of making sense of that.